I care deeply about my wife, and I want you to understand this from the very beginning. Our relationship goes back to high school, where we had a strong friendship, and she became the person I trusted the most. Naturally, we followed the path of a romantic relationship. Our first time together was on her 18th birthday, and I'm proud to say that I was on top that night. Let me introduce myself. I'm Cal Wilson. I stand about 5 feet 11 inches and weigh around 175 to 180 pounds, though I don't check the scale daily. At 32, I'm in pretty good shape thanks to my daily runs, a habit I picked up from my track and field days in high school and college. I have dark brown hair with a few premature gray streaks, but people usually say my best feature is my emerald green eyes. I work as a detective with the local police department. Our town's pretty quiet, so my job tends to be easy. My wife is Julie Wilson, formerly Julie Vickers. Yeah, her mom spelled her name with 2 E's at the end. Guess it was for uniqueness. Not that it made much difference. Julie and I are the couple everyone always said was meant to be together. She's stunning. Long auburn hair, striking sky blue eyes, and a figure that could stop a war. 36C 2337, and she's 5 feet 6 inches. She's also 32. After college, we decided to tie the knot, and for the last 10 years, life's been amazing. We went through the Kama Sutra page by page, and our intimacy life never missed a beat. I treated her to romantic dinners and dates regularly, not just for special occasions. She works as a paralegal at one of the town's 2 law firms. Then there's Jimmy Green, the guy who used to be the high school quarterback, someone whose luck always seemed to favor him. He was the golden boy until a knee injury playing NCAA football left him unable to fully recover. When he came back to town, his father, who's the mayor, set him up with a job at City Hall, which works closely with the sheriff's office. Jimmy had always had an interest in Julie. Back in high school, he'd track us down on our dates, and even though he had a girlfriend, he would openly flirt with Julie in front of both me and his own girlfriend, Cynthia. To her credit, Julie never reciprocated, though some of the things Jimmy said made her blush, which only made me angrier. I made it clear to him that if he ever seriously tried to pursue Julie, there would be consequences. He just smiled and assured me that it was all just harmless fun. Jimmy and Cynthia got married right after she graduated from college, and by then he'd already been working at City Hall for a year. How do they play into my story? Well, we'll get to that shortly. About a year ago, Julie and I had plans for a Friday night when I received a call from Sheriff Barton. He apologized for disturbing my day off but said I needed to head to work. I asked what was going on, and he explained that all patrol cars were tied up, but there was a domestic disturbance near my house. Since I was closest, he asked me to go straight there. Sheriff Barton wasn't going to take no for an answer, even though I was off that night. Not wanting to cause any trouble, I apologized to my wife, strapped on my belt, badge, and holstered my .357 Magnum, and drove to the address he gave me. Sure enough, it was Sue Roberts who had called, reporting that her husband, Hunter, was hitting her again. He was drunk, as usual, and had taken his frustrations out on her and their kids. It took a while to calm him down and bring him in for booking. As always, Sue declined to press charges. As usual, I told her she needed to get him help, and she promised, once again, that she would get rid of all the alcohol in the house. I sighed in frustration. Every month or two it was the same call, the same situation. But tonight, things were a little different. I was stuck at the office with paperwork until about midnight, and when I finally got home, I found Jimmy and Julie sitting on the couch. Julie looked like she'd taken another shower since I left for work. A chill ran down my spine. What the hell was he doing here, I thought. What's going on, Jimmy? Honey, I asked, leaning down to kiss her. Sorry about earlier. Hunter got arrested again, and I'm hoping Sue will either leave him or finally get him the help he needs. No worries, sweetheart, she replied with a smile. Cynthia went out of town with her parents, and Jimmy called right after you left to see if we had plans tonight. Yeah, man, my bad. I didn't realize it was your date night, Jimmy said with a shrug. I guess it was lucky you got that call, huh? He flashed that smug grin, reminding me once again what a grade A jerk this guy was. The alarms were going off in my head. Jimmy's always been a snake, thinking he's better than everyone else. I decided to stay civil. Well, sorry to hear about Cynthia, Jimmy, but if you don't mind, I'd like to take my wife to bed and make up for having to go into work tonight. Oh, sure, man. No problem. He stood up quickly and saw himself out. I locked the door behind him and went back to Julie. Baby, I'm really sorry about earlier, I said, pulling her into my arms. Next Friday. I'm telling them to get Bill or Dave to cover for me, okay? Julia knew what it was like to be married to a policeman sometimes. She smiled. It's okay, honey. Jimmy and I just stopped by for a little chat, you know. I smiled back. Don't worry, baby, I said, although a slight worry began to creep into me. At least there was nothing in her behavior that hinted at anything more. Although I couldn't completely trust Jimmy, I knew I could trust Julie. After all, I've trusted her for more than half my life. That night we made love, and in the end, the night was not in vain. That, however, was just the start. Over the next 2 months, we managed to fit in only 2 date nights amidst all my work commitments. Julie was getting increasingly frustrated, and so was I. Unfortunately, while I was getting annoyed with my boss, she was getting frustrated with me. From her perspective, I was prioritizing the job over our relationship. I couldn't really fault her for feeling that way. Cynthia had to travel out of town more frequently after her parents moved to the big city. She would often go for long weekends whenever they needed something. One Sunday, she came back early, and before I knew it, I was receiving a call from her. Detective Wilson, I answered my cell. Cal, thank God. You need to get over here now. She nearly screamed into the phone. She was clearly upset, so I asked what was wrong. Just come to my house, she said. Not our house, but my house. Was something going on with Jimmy? I was at the sheriff's office, so I told Barton that I had received a call from Cynthia and needed the rest of the day off. He looked at me oddly, but simply nodded and went back to his crossword puzzle. I quickly drove over to Jimmy and Cynthia's house and was startled to see Julie's car in the driveway. It triggered a major alarm in my mind. Cynthia was pacing outside, and when she saw me, she ran up with tears in her eyes and threw herself into my arms. My unmarked vehicle was actually my own car, equipped with a radio, sirens, and lights. I really like my Dodge Charger. Cal, thank God you're here. I don't know what to do, she cried into my chest, hugging me tightly. Whoa, take it easy, Cyn. What's happening? I asked, trying to stay calm. She looked up at me, and I could see my confusion mirrored in her expression as I glanced from Julie's car back to her. Suddenly her face went pale, and she covered her mouth with her hands. Cal, don't you know what's going on? Why is your wife's car here? You mean you don't know? Her eyes widened in shock. Know what? What the hell is happening, Cyn? I was getting frustrated, and the alarm bells in my head were ringing louder. Then it struck me. Damn it! I shouted as I pulled out my weapon and rushed toward the door. I opened the door and headed back to the bedroom. Kicking open the door, I saw a shocking scene. I blinked twice at the sight of the frozen lovers. My heart sank when I saw Julie, along with Jimmy. I've known since our high school locker room that Jimmy wasn't as gifted as me. I holstered my gun and turned to Julie, pulling out my phone to start taking pictures. I managed to take 4 pictures before they came to their senses. "I can explain, honey," Julie called out while I was still photographing the scene. Ignoring her, I turned to Cynthia, who had followed me in. "Cyn, did you know about this?" I asked, keeping my tone calm and ignoring my wife's pleas. "Yes, Cal." "I honestly thought you knew too. I wasn't happy about it, but I knew Jimmy had needs when I wasn't there," Cynthia admitted, blushing but meeting my gaze firmly. "You didn't like it? And you thought I knew?" I asked, keeping calm. "Yes. Julie said she discussed it with you, and since you often work on Sundays, she will come here sometimes." Cynthia's eyes filled with tears again. "I didn't realize how bad it was until I saw them together." "Okay, here's what we'll do. If you two are having such a whirlwind romance, I'll take Cynthia to my house and deal with her properly. Is that okay with you, Cyn?" I asked her. "Damn it, no, you won't lay a finger on her." Julie and Jimmy screamed in unison. Cynthia looked at them with disgust, then turned to me. "You know what, Cal? I want you to take me to your place." She gave me a cheeky wink. Jimmy screamed, jumping out of bed and heading towards me. I pulled out my weapon and pointed it right at him. "Jimmy, don't be a fool. What's good for the goose is good for the gander." He froze, raising his hands as my Colt python was pointed directly at him. "How long have you been sleeping with my wife?" 2 months, he muttered, fear and anger reflected on his face. "Since the night I was called to Hunter and Sue?" I asked, and he nodded. "And you used protection every time?" "Yes," he replied. I believed him, but I wanted to hear it from Julie, too. "And Julie? It's true? Did he use protective equipment when he was sleeping with you?" I asked, not taking my eyes off her but continuing to aim at Jimmy. "Yes, it's true. Now stop it, I'm still yours, Cal," begged Julie. "I still love you, but sometimes I just need something new, and Jimmy is perfect." She begged. "What? So you can have affairs, but I can't?" I stared at her in disbelief. I looked at Cynthia's dark hair and green eyes. She was amazing, too. My love for Julie blinded me to other women, but now that I saw things more clearly, I saw Cyn in a different way. I turned to Julie. "You hate double standards, right? Well, that's double standards. If you're going to cheat on me with Jimmy, then I'm going to cheat on you with Cyn. Everything is fair." I shrugged, still holding the gun pointed at Jimmy. "I can't believe you were in our bed with her," Cynthia yelled at Jimmy. "Honey, it's not what you think," Jimmy said. "You know I have needs. I told you about it, and you agreed to let me sleep with Julie if Cal found out about it. It's just intimacy." "But I didn't know about it," I shouted back. "You knew I'd never share it, especially with someone like you, but you thought it was okay, didn't you?" Now I was furious, and if I could, I would have shot them both on the spot. I turned to Cyn. "Honey, take everything you need for a few days." She nodded and went to get the essentials. I looked back at Julie. "What's the real reason, Julie?" "Your job, asshole," she snapped, and her face contorted with rage. "You're always working, and at least Jimmy is always with me." "Did you sleep in our bed with him?" I asked calmly. The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, her initial rage replaced by shame. I had my answer ready before she spoke. "Yes," she replied softly. "Well, this will be a great addition to the festive dinner," I said, simply nodding. "When were you going to tell me, Julie? When did you file for divorce?" "Cal," Damn it. It's not like that. I love you, but sometimes I need something else. And considering that you're always working, Jimmy is what I need. But I love you anyway. Julie took up a defensive position again, as if her infidelity could be justified by her continued affection for me. No, Julie. If you really loved me, you wouldn't cheat on me, especially with him, I retorted, leaving her without an answer. At least he used protective equipment. But now, I need to be tested for diseases. Sin. Is he using protective equipment with you? Ever since they told me a couple of months ago that they would have fun while I was out of town, I've been forcing him to use protective equipment with me, she said, coming back to me. During our conversation, Cynthia packed a suitcase with her toiletries and clothes. Good. It reduces the risk of infection, I said, nodding. I knew that Julie was still on birth control, but I knew that Jimmy had a reputation as a notorious womanizer since high school. As far as I knew, Julie was his first extramarital affair. She looked at Jimmy. I'm going to stay with Cal. If you want to stay married to me, stay away until I get back. I can't believe you're both like this. She screamed at them. She left first, and I followed her, keeping the gun pointed at Jimmy to make sure he didn't do anything reckless. We managed to get to my car without any problems, but on the way home my mobile phone rang. I ignored Julie's calls but answered the sheriff's call. Hi, Cal, what's happening? Jimmy just called. Sheriff Barton is Jimmy's maternal uncle. Sir, your nephew has been sleeping with my wife for the last 2 months, and Cynthia found out that I didn't know about it. She was also unhappy with the current situation. She and I are on our way to my place now, and I'm taking the rest of the day off, as well as tomorrow. I brought him up to speed. Oh my God. He sighed. I was afraid something like this might happen. Wait, did you know? I shouted into the phone. I'm sorry, son, he began. Leave it alone, asshole. I snapped back and hung up before he could say anything else. Then I looked at Cynthia. Did you know that he knew? I asked. God, no, she said, and her face showed disbelief. I can't believe it. Now she was furious too. Okay, Cal. When we get back to you, we need to relieve all the stress. You're damn right. I smiled at her. It was as if for the first time I saw a woman in her and not just a friend. But first I need to make some calls and sort things out at home. Then I'm all yours. I promised. As soon as I took Cynthia home, Julie called again. What? I answered sharply. Don't you dare sleep with her, Calvin Wilson, she screamed over the phone. Either I sleep with her, or I divorce you. What will it be? Do you remember I have photos? I replied. In our state, evidence of adultery on the part of a wife can affect the division of property in a divorce. Julie was so quiet that I thought she'd hung up. Then she said, Good, before ending the conversation. I sent her a message telling her not to come home tonight and then called the locksmith. My cousin Dennis, who I trusted, was the locksmith. When he arrived, he looked at Cynthia with a puzzled expression. Sin and I were having a couple of beers when he showed up and let himself in. Hey, Den, I greeted him. What's up, man? He asked. I gave him a brief summary and asked him to change the locks and provide me with 3 sets of keys. I specifically requested that he not give a key to Julie if she came by asking for one. He agreed without hesitation. Blood is thicker than water, Cal, he said, and we shook on it. Dennis is a reliable guy, and I knew I could count on him through thick and thin. Next, I called the furniture store and ordered a new king-sized bed to replace the queen-sized one that Julie and I had shared. Sin waited patiently while the movers arrived soon after. They disassembled the old bed and piled it in the backyard as instructed, then set up the new bed according to my specifications. It wasn't cheap, but it would be worth it in the end. I had a plan, actually several plans, and I hoped the least violent one would be the one I could execute. Dennis finished changing the locks and handed me 3 sets of keys as requested. I gave one set to Sin with a wink, and she smiled back. After paying the furniture movers with my credit card, I called my sister Olivia, the bank manager in our town. I asked her to open a new account for me first thing Monday morning. I explained the situation and requested that she transfer 75% of the savings and checking accounts into the new account. She was happy to help, as she had never liked Julie. It turned out that Liv is an excellent judge of character. Once everyone who didn't live there or wasn't staying as my guest had left, it was just Cynthia and me. Instead of heading straight to bed, I took her to the living room, and we sat on the couch after I locked up the house. Shin, what we're going to do is just a petty revenge. You understand that, right? I asked, meeting her green eyes. Yes, I know, Cal. Before we cross the line, I have to ask you something. I took her hand. Sin, you deserve better than Jimmy, and you always have. What I don't understand is why you put up with his nonsense. Cynthia blushed deeply. He has full control over all bank accounts. He said that if I left him, I would be left with nothing. He claimed to know all the lawyers in the city, but none of them would take my case. He's lying to you, honey, I said, kissing her. Listen to me. Do you want to leave him? Don't worry about finding a lawyer. Just answer yes or no. Do you want to get away from this lying bastard? Yes, but not only because of the betrayal. He ... She started crying, then rolled up the sleeve of her blouse to show me the bruise from his grip on her shoulder. I closed my eyes and sighed. Damn it, I muttered, shaking my head. It just put an end to my plan. Given that the good old guys work in law enforcement, Sheriff Barton and the district attorney are unlikely to decide to bring the golden boy to justice. Most likely, he will escape responsibility for the years of abuse to which Sin was subjected. But now I had leverage on the sheriff, proof that he not only knew about this affair, but also facilitated it by leaving me at work so they could be together for 2 months. Listen, honey, I have a statewide police certificate. I'm calling the divorce lawyer from my wife's rival firm tomorrow. We will provide representation. Sheriff Barton can't fire me, and he knows it. I took a deep breath. I care about you very much, Sin, and he always did. You've been one of my closest friends since childhood, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let that jerk of a husband of yours hurt you again. With the photos on my SIM card, you will have solid evidence against him, and you will get everything you deserve. At these words, her eyes sparkled. Cal, would you really help me even knowing what happened? Of course, I replied. You didn't know that I knew about it, and you didn't realize how serious it was. Now that we know, we need to be careful. I know Sheriff Barton and I suspect he was forced into this situation. I'll talk to him tomorrow morning and tell him I'm taking the day off. I continued. As soon as we have a lawyer, we'll go to the station together, and if you want, you can press charges against Jimmy. But will he at least agree? She began to ask. Yes, he will agree as soon as I show him the photos. Until we hand them the divorce papers, we will use the threat of divorce as leverage. Here's my plan. We'll corner them with blackmail and then set a trap. I explained with a smile. It also involves blackmailing their relatives and sending photos to Julie's parents. By the time we're done, they won't have anything left. I winked. Cynthia laughed melodiously. I like your way of thinking. "And remind me never to make you angry," she said warmly, then kissed me. After a long pause, she pulled back and stared into my eyes. "Cal, forget about simple intimacy today. I want you to make love to me." Her voice was so cool. It was still a novelty for me to be with someone other than my wife. But Julie made a decision. She knew how I felt about cheating, but she went for it anyway. And so I was ready to take a little revenge before the real reckoning began. No, this was no longer just a petty revenge. I've talked to Cynthia many times over the years, and we've found a lot in common. Starting from our shared love of country and jazz and ending with similar tastes in cinema, which even Julie and I did not have. You know, Cal, if Julie hadn't taken over your heart back then, I would have flirted with you in high school, Cynthia confessed, blushing deeply. If Julie wasn't in the picture, I'd fall for you, Cynthia Smithson, I replied, giving her her maiden name. At that moment, my phone rang. I set it to vibrate, and when I checked, Julie called. I grinned as I answered. "What now, Julie?" I asked in an exasperated tone. "Cal, it's not too late for us. We can still talk about it," she said in that whiny voice I couldn't stand. "Can we? Are you going to stop seeing Jimmy?" I asked. She began, but I ended the call and turned off my phone before she could call back. "What did she say?" Cynthia asked. She said, and that was the only answer I needed. I shrugged. Then I pulled Cynthia back to me and kissed her gently. "But enough about her. You're just beautiful," I said softly, breaking the kiss. I got up from the couch, took her hand, and led her into the bedroom. When we finally came down from heaven, I lay down next to her. There was no guilt between us, just a strange new satisfaction that neither of us had experienced before, complete satisfaction and a deep sense of pleasure. "It was the best intimacy of my life," Cynthia whispered. "Me too," I replied, and the smile, as it seemed to me, would never disappear from my face. We looked at each other and kissed gently. "We need to figure out what's going to happen next." She nodded. "Yes, it is. I can't go back to Jimmy right now. What we have in common is too special for me to pretend to be with him anymore. Not that I've ever been really happy with him." A sense of guilt began to creep into me. I was happy with Julie. At least that's what I thought. But now, at least at this moment, I have found a new level of happiness with someone else. It made me stop and think. Was that how Julie felt with Jimmy? Even though I despised Jimmy for many years, it was hard for me to hate Julie. I was still outraged by what she had done and that she had permanently undermined my trust, but I began to understand where she came from. Then the anger returned to me when I remembered that my own boss had been a part of this whole thing from the very beginning. He distracted me by giving his arrogant nephew the opportunity to poach Julie. But Julie wasn't innocent either. She could have stopped it at any moment. She could have refused Jimmy. We were both manipulated, but I was played much worse than Julie. I shared my feelings with Cynthia, and her face showed a mixture of guilt and sadness. "I'm so sorry, Cal," she whispered, gently stroking my cheek. "Darling, when Julie told you that I supposedly didn't mind, how did she put it? What did she say I had to do with it?" I asked, determined to expose Julie's lies. According to her, it sounded like your feelings reflected mine. That even though you didn't like it at all, you would have accepted it because you understood that she had needs, Cynthia explained. My anger at Julie was growing. I just nodded. "Good. I'm going to approach this case like the detective that I am and reveal all the details." Then I told her my plan. She laughed when I finished. "You're mean, but I love you anyway," she said, with a playful twinkle in her eyes. "And you are the embodiment of the Greek goddess," I replied. "And I love you too." We spent the rest of the day and evening making love. By the end of the night, I was practically reduced to dust. I had nothing left. Then I told her that we needed food to survive. "Okay, baby, let's take a shower and then I'll cook us something to eat." She smiled, and I gladly agreed. After our shower, we dried off and headed to the kitchen, where Cynthia whipped up some pork chops and vegetables. She experimented with a variety of spices she found in the cupboard, and the chops turned out incredible. The veggies, covered in cheddar cheese sauce, were just as delicious, and before long we were both full and satisfied. We sat at the table discussing our future plans once we were done eating. I praised her cooking skills, telling her with complete honesty that she was a far better cook than Julie. She blushed and smiled as she accepted the compliment, and I kissed her lovingly. For a brief moment, my plan wavered in my mind as I realized I didn't hate Julie as much anymore. Yes, she had been an unfaithful cheat, but in an odd way, she had unintentionally brought Cynthia and me together. But no. The thought of her with him, doing things she never seemed to enjoy with me, reignited my anger. I resolved that she would get nothing from me beyond what the court might allow, especially once those photos were entered as evidence. I had a plan, but it would take time to work out all the details and set things in motion. That night, we fell asleep in each other's arms, something Julie always hated. She needed her space while sleeping. But Sin was different. She loved to cuddle, and I loved cuddling with her. The one good thing about our upcoming divorces was that neither of us had kids. In my case with Julie, we just weren't ready yet, according to her. She wanted to save up some money from her paralegal job, which paid pretty well, before we started trying for a baby. Sin, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with having Jimmy's kids, and made that very clear. After the way he'd been acting for the last 2 months, she was actually relieved she hadn't given in to his constant pleas for her to stay home and have babies. Cynthia works as a real estate agent, so she basically sets her own hours. With the real estate market booming in what used to be our small town, she's been making a lot of money. The tricky part was getting that money out of the joint account she shared with Jimmy at the bank. I thought about involving Liv, but didn't want her to face any fallout if things went wrong. Sin had her sales receipts and pay stubs from her job, so we could sue for her earnings and take Jimmy to the cleaners regardless. With our plan in place, we got into the car the next morning and headed to see a lawyer. We met with Phil, Liv's husband, and my brother-in-law, and he agreed to take our case at a family discount. Essentially, he was handling the case for next to nothing, with the added motivation of going after Jimmy. See, Jimmy had made a pass at Liv once, and Phil never forgot that. It was becoming clear that, outside of his own family, Jimmy didn't have many allies. Phil prepared divorce papers for both spouses, and I sent him the photos I'd taken the day before as evidence. The timestamps on the pictures were enough proof, and, combined with their own admissions about how long the affair had been going on, it gave Phil leverage in drafting the legal terms for both divorces. He agreed to dig up more dirt on them and have the papers served by Tuesday. After we finished at Phil's office, we went to see Sheriff Barton. "Hey, Bart," I said as I walked in, keeping my voice calm and a smile on my face as Cynthia followed me inside. I sent him the photos on his phone, telling him the reason would soon be clear. I glanced at Sin. "Show him what you showed me yesterday," I said, gesturing toward her arm. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a bruise from Jimmy's grip. "Jimmy does this to me almost daily." "Well, did it to me, since I'm not going back. I want to press charges against him." Well, that might be he started, but I cut him off. Bart, unless you want those photos I just sent you plastered all over the internet and City Hall, you're going to arrest that scumbag yourself and book him. Then you're going to the DA and make sure charges are filed for spousal abuse. I know that without this pressure, his actions would just get swept under the rug like always. I don't want to do this, but I will if necessary. I made it clear. Now, I want to know the full extent of your involvement in Jimmy and Julie's affair. If you don't tell me, these photos will go public with your name attached as an accomplice. Sheriff Barton was backed into a corner and he knew it. I discreetly started recording just before he began to speak. "Ah, hell, I'm sorry about this whole mess, Cal," he said with a wince. "I never should have let Jimmy and Fred talk me into it." "The mayor too? How do they manage that?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "He said that he and Julie were in love, and that he needed me to get you out of the way so he could be with her." That made me raise my other eyebrow. I was pretty sure Jimmy was lying at that point, but I couldn't be absolutely sure. "Go on," I said, nodding. "It all started that night when I called you to come out to Hunter and Sue's place. Jimmy said that even though they were in love, they didn't want a messy divorce and wanted to stay married to both of you." He took a deep, shaky breath before continuing. "He also said that they had an agreement with both of you, that when you were at work or out of town they would be together. I thought that was the end of it. I had my suspicions, but I didn't want to stir up trouble. I knew Cynthia was aware, but I kind of figured you weren't, Cal. Blood is thicker than water, though, so I kept my mouth shut and kept sending you on every pointless call I could find. Man, you have no idea how sorry I am for all of this." Seeing the pain on his face, I believed him. It didn't change the fact that he had betrayed me, but I was reconsidering my plan to bury his career so deep he'd never work in law enforcement again. "I thought of you as family, Bart. I guess you didn't feel the same about me," I said, shaking my head. "No, this was no longer about revenge. This was about true justice. Everyone was going to get exactly what they deserved." I took a deep breath and asked him another question. "Who else knew about this besides you?" He froze, looking like a deer caught in headlights. The same expression I'd seen on Julie's and Jimmy's faces in the pictures I had just sent him. "Remember, tell the truth, or everyone will hear about your involvement." As a detective, I had practically mastered reading people, acting like a human lie detector. The only one I couldn't see through had been the woman I was married to for 10 damn years. She had fooled me completely. Barton, on the other hand, was an open book. "If I tell you, will you keep my name out of it? Will you erase the recording in your pocket?" he asked. Give him credit. He was sharp, and as a detective himself, he had to be. At that moment, I made the biggest decision regarding Barton's future. I turned off the recorder and erased it right in front of him. "You're off the hook, Barton," I said with a nod. I was giving him a pass, but not entirely. He would still have to face his family once this was all over. At least he'd still be able to work in law enforcement. "Now tell me who else knows I've been cheated on," I growled. "Just Fred, Jimmy, and some other men in their family," he said, then immediately regretted using the word men. I knew exactly where those pictures were headed next. I smiled, and he paled as he realized the full extent of his mistake. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "So the mayor knew and enabled it, as did Judge Green," I said, confirming his earlier confession. That meant packets were going to both of their wives with a note, "Your husband knew about this." Janet Green was a good woman, a friend of my parents since before she married Fred Green, the mayor of our town. Alice Green, the judge's wife, was more of a tough character, but even she deserved to know what her husband had allowed to happen. It felt odd that Julie hadn't tried to call me today. That thought had barely crossed my mind when my phone buzzed. Sure enough, it was Julie. "Detective Wilson," I answered, my usual response when on duty. "Cal, are you at work?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm in Bart's office doing some paperwork. What's up?" I kept my tone casual. "Are you ready to talk yet?" she pressed. "What's there to talk about, Julie?" I replied. "The fact that I still love you," she said. "The fact that I know you still love me." That took me by surprise. Even though she'd completely messed things up between us, I realized I still had some lingering feelings for her. "When do you want to talk?" I asked. "I can take the rest of the day off, but you won't be able to get into the house. I've changed the locks," I told her. "Can you at least let me in to get my clothes?" "We could talk then," she suggested. I agreed. "Sure, no problem. Cynthia's going to be there too. She's with me at work right now," I added, thinking it would help me avoid being tempted. I glanced at Sin, who had a worried look on her face. "Fine," Julie replied, tension heavy in her voice before she hung up. I turned back to Barton. "So does anyone other than the mayor, you, Judge Green, and Jimmy know that he's been messing around with my wife?" "No, just us," he confirmed. "And Cynthia, too," he added, as if trying to involve her. "She already told me, and that's because Jimmy controls all their money," I said through gritted teeth. "Now, are you sending the evidence to the DA?" Bart pulled out his digital camera, took some photos of the grip marks and other bruises on her body, checked them, and transferred them to his computer to compile and send. "Yeah, it's going today. I'll email it after I pick up Jimmy." He nodded. He had to handle it since he was one of the few I could trust to keep quiet about Jimmy's mess. I'd stay silent, for now. Good. The sooner he's off the streets, the better. I'd go myself, but you know, I shrugged. I didn't want to be involved in his arrest, especially after news of his affair with Julie broke. "Yeah, I get it. I'm not thrilled about what you're doing, but what he did to you is unforgivable in my eyes. And hitting his own wife? That's not what I'm here to protect him from. He's going down for that, as far as I'm concerned. If he wasn't family, I wouldn't have helped him." "You have to believe that, son," Barton said. It hit me. I'd known Sheriff Stanley Bart Barton my whole life, and up until yesterday I'd respected and admired him. I still liked him, but my respect for him had taken a serious hit after his betrayal. "I believe you, Bart. Now I need to give Julie her clothes and get her out of my house," I said, shaking his hand. "Will you come tomorrow?" he asked. "No, today I officially start my 5-day vacation. I'll be back next Monday," I replied with a smile. "Okay, that sounds great." He smiled back, and I had the feeling that once everything settled down, he would be fine. But I'm not done yet. As promised, I sent an email to Mayor Green and Mrs. Green, attaching all the necessary information so that it coincided with the arrest of Jimmy by his uncle. When we got home, Julie was already waiting for us. Sin and I walked to the door holding hands and just looked at Julie. Jealousy showed on her face. "Hi, Julie," Cynthia said. "Did you enjoy having fun with my husband? I could ask you the same thing, a girl of easy virtue." Julie sneered at Cynthia. Now that I've compared them, Sin has clearly surpassed Julie in every way. "Well, well, ladies. Julie, what did we say about double standards?" I asked calmly, smiling at her and looking at her meaningfully. "Remember, if you hadn't slept with Jimmy, I wouldn't have slept with Cynthia." This silenced her before she could answer. I continued, "Julie, what else is left to discuss?" You made it clear yesterday how little I meant to you when you were with Jimmy. There was no respect, no love, only obvious contempt. Instead of sincerely repenting of what you did, you first came up with excuses, then criticized my work. Yea, now pack your things and leave my house. Julie, if you don't need a guy like him, I'll be happy to get rid of him, Sin said with a smug smile. Yes, we poked Julie's nose in it, and it was damn nice. Julie couldn't hold back the tears anymore, and they poured out like a river. I'm so sorry, Cal, she sobbed, truly breaking down, something I'd rarely seen before. I've ruined everything. No, you didn't screw up, you screwed up. Did you know that Jimmy beat Cynthia? I glanced at Sin, who was demonstrating. I know that at that time she went to church with heavy makeup, and I can imagine what was hidden under it. I remember not paying much attention to it at the time and even made a comment to Jimmy about the amount of makeup on her face. Soon after I noticed that she was wearing less makeup. Oh God, I'm sorry, Sin. I had no idea. Julie looked like she'd just seen a ghost, or maybe a vision of her own future, if she left me for Jimmy. But that's all in the past now, and I'm not going to lie. I'm going to do what I should have done years ago and divorce this jerk. I'm going to clean him out. Me too, I said, looking at Julie. It was time to lay out the terms of her surrender. Julie, we're done. I claim 75% of our joint property, which is enough for you to find your own place, since the house is registered in my name and rightfully belongs to me. You can keep your car, and I'll keep mine. The remaining property will be divided in a ratio of 75-25s. If you dispute this, these photos will go to your family, mine, and all other interested parties. I would prefer to deal with this quickly and cleanly, but if necessary, I am ready to fight dirty. There is no turning back. It's over between us. You already know my attitude to cheating. Last night, before I had fun with Cynthia, you cheated on me with Jimmy for 2 whole months. Julie stopped crying. But I love you, Cal, she pleaded. No, Julie. If you really loved me, you would respect me and the vows we made when we got married. For me, yesterday's meeting with Jimmy was the end of our marriage. It remains only to make it official. Tomorrow, at work, you will be handed divorce papers due to adultery. My lawyer already has photos as evidence, and he will present them in court. I paused for my words to sink in, and then continued. Julie, will you give me a divorce so we can move on? She looked down, completely shattered. Yes, she said in a barely audible voice. Thanks. Now let's get your things together. After today's revelations, I don't think you want to go back to Jimmy, especially since he's just been arrested, I said. You're right, but where will I stop? She asked. I left enough money in your account for the initial payment for the apartment, and some more. It was our shared account, but I transferred 75% of the funds to an account in my name and deleted my name from the shared account. So now it's all yours. I shrugged my shoulders. I hope you can handle it. As much as I want to hate you, I just can't. We've known each other for too long, but I can't and won't forgive what you did to me, to us. Julie looked gloomy. She was obviously in pain, but I restrained myself. It was hard, but I had to do it. Part of me wanted to hug her and assure her that everything would be fine, but I knew it wasn't. If she really loved me, she would have stopped seeing Jimmy when I asked. Damn it. If she loved me, she wouldn't be with him at all. That single thought was all I needed to brace myself against her sorrow and undeniable charms. Objectively speaking, side by side, she didn't compare to Cynthia at all. Despite this, she was still stunning in her own way. Cynthia helped us pack up all of Julie's belongings, and it took an eternity. By the time we finished, It was too late to search for apartments, and we were completely exhausted. We flopped down in the living room, surrounded by suitcases filled with Julie's stuff. Her closet, dresser, nightstand, makeup table, and even the sink in the master bath were emptied out. Well, you get the picture. I never realized you had so much stuff, Jules. I chuckled, despite myself, as Cynthia entered, handed us both a beer, and then sat down in my lap. Julie looked at us with a wistful expression. There was no jealousy this time, just a sense of what she had lost. Well, it's been over 10 years since I moved in here, and you know I never throw anything away as long as it's still usable. Julie shrugged, making me chuckle again. I know, I smirked. Jules, it's late. You can stay in the guest room if you want. Cynthia leaned close and whispered in my ear. Is that a good idea? I don't hate her, Cyn. As much as I might want to, I just can't. I don't love her anymore, but I still care about what happens to her, I whispered back. Then I looked at the hopeful expression on Julie's face. Jules, this is just for tonight. You can sleep in the guest room, but in the morning, pack up your car. And remember, you'll be served with the divorce papers at work. I made sure she understood the reality of the situation. Julie stifled a sob. Is that really necessary? She finally asked. How about we just go to your lawyer in the morning and I'll sign everything there? I considered it. Although I was eager to make her feel humiliated, I also recalled the good times we'd shared over the years. Funny how memory works. I glanced at Cyn and raised an eyebrow. What do you think? Should we? I asked. Cynthia looked at Julie and saw the complete despair in her eyes. She then looked back at me. I think she's suffered enough for now, and yes, I think that would work. I turned to Julie. All right, we'll go to Phil's office in the morning. You can sign the papers there, and then we can have the judge finalize our divorce. We're not going to counseling and won't need to discuss child custody. So there's that. A small smile appeared on Julie's face. She had avoided my wrath for now, though the real trouble was yet to come. I see you've already replaced the bed, she said, her voice still small and remorseful. Yeah, I needed an upgrade anyway. I didn't realize at the time that Cyn here is a cuddler. If I had known, I might have opted for the queen size, I said, smiling and taking a dig at Julie. She visibly flinched at the comment. I really wasn't that good a wife, was I? She said, likely feeling the weight of her decisions. You were a good wife. Until you decided to not only cheat on me, but with someone like Jimmy Green. You knew how I felt about him. You knew he was always trying to get into your pants. You knew I told him that if he came after you again, he'd have to pay. Well, the time for payment has arrived. If you don't want to get caught in the fallout, I suggest you leave town as soon as the divorce is finalized, I said evenly, emphasizing each new. Julie looked worried. What do you mean, Cal? I mean exactly what I say, Jules. Look, I don't hate you, but there's a storm on the horizon. When the mayor himself allows his son to sleep with another man's wife, fully aware that his son is wrong, it will have serious consequences. Although it is not illegal for him to know about it, or even give his tacit consent, it is illegal for him to force his husband to work while giving his son the opportunity to do so. I made it up to protect Bart, who at least had a conscience to help him when I was flaunting it all over town. I have reliable information that Mayor Green organized my night shifts on Fridays, although I was usually free that evening. He also made sure that I was busy on Sundays. Julie's eyes widened. My God! Jimmy used his own father to frame us? All of this was strangely beginning to make sense. Jimmy was a jerk for a reason. He took after his father, who was the main candidate for the title of the biggest jerk in the universe. Mayor Green has certainly proved himself worthy of this title with his recent actions. Yes, Mayor Green was second on my list right after Jimmy Green, but before Judge Green. Bart managed to avoid this list, but I had a feeling that he would not come out of it completely unscathed. I took out my cell phone and called Phil. "Hi, Cal. How are you?" Phil answered. "Plans have changed, Phil. Julie will come tomorrow morning with Sin and me and sign the papers at your office. Is this normal?" I informed him of the changes. "Of course it works, but let her bring her lawyer." "I don't want any further problems to arise," Phil replied. "Understood. I'll let her know." I nodded. "Thanks, Phil. Anytime, brother, I'll cover for you." He hung up the phone. I turned to Julie. "Don't forget to bring your lawyer with you in the morning when we see Phil." Julie swallowed hard and nodded. After we finished our beers, we went to bed. Julie crashed in the guest room while Sin locked the door behind us when we went to bed in our room. I had a peculiar feeling that Cynthia and I would be sharing that bed for the rest of our lives. The next morning, Julie called her lawyer and had him meet us at Phil's office. After Julie explained the situation, the lawyer looked at her with wide eyes but didn't say anything as he reviewed the divorce papers and evidence. When he was done, he handed the papers to Julie. "This is the best deal you're going to get, Jules. Take it and run," he advised. Julie, bless her, took his advice. 30 days later, after the mandatory cooling-off period, we were officially divorced. The real battle wasn't the divorce from Julie. It was going to be with Jimmy Green and his father and uncle at City Hall. Fortunately, thanks to the email I sent to their wives, we had an ally in Janet Green. Alice Green hadn't replied, and I assumed she had her own plans for dealing with the honorable judge. Judge Reinhold, no relation, reviewed the evidence, and Jimmy was held without bond under house arrest at his home due to his record, which had been previously covered up but was recently exposed by his own mother. It turned out Jimmy was not only violent, but also a flight risk. With a huge trust fund from his father, Jimmy became the target of Phil, who was now representing Cynthia in her divorce from Jimmy. Since Jimmy foolishly contested the divorce, Phil went after the trust fund with full force. When Jimmy eventually pleaded out, he was sentenced to probation, but remained on house arrest. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do for now. I got a call at work from Cynthia, who was living with me full-time, saying that Janet Green was at the house. I said I'd be right there, informed Bart that his sister was at my place, and he just nodded and smiled. I hurried home. When I arrived, Cynthia and Janet were having coffee in the living room. I greeted them after kissing Cynthia on the cheek, saying, "I'm here, ma'am." "Cal, it's nice to see you. And thank you for that insightful email," Cynthia replied with a slight smile. "If I had known my son was doing that to you two with my husband's full knowledge and support, I would have put a stop to it." "Ma'am, not many people were aware of it," I said, shaking my head. "It wouldn't be fair to say you should have known." "My brother knew and enabled it." Cynthia's tone turned steely. "My husband knew and enabled it. My brother-in-law knew and enabled it. That so-called son of mine has gone too far this time. To seduce another man's wife and then use his own family to cover it up. Let me assure you, I will do whatever I can for you." She gave a firm nod. I had expected her to be supportive, maybe, but I never anticipated she would be so committed to our cause. "Thank you, Janet," Cynthia said as she hugged her soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law. "Any time, sugar," Janet replied with a smile. Then she asked me, after Cynthia had settled back down, "Do you think Phil will take my divorce case?" I think he could be convinced, I nodded and smiled. Mrs. Green, Janet, California. You should know that by now. She chided me with a motherly grin. Okay, Janet, I hope you don't think less of me for getting involved with Cynthia, I said, slightly uneasy about how she would perceive this situation. Nonsense, Cal. She laughed. You two deserve to be happy, and given what Julie and Jimmy did to both of you, I have a feeling that finding happiness together is in the cards for you. Now I know I could have sued Jimmy, his father, and perhaps even his uncles for alienation of affection. But why bother? It's a weak lawsuit, mostly difficult to prove. No, what I had planned for Jimmy and his father was far, far worse. After my thorough investigation, I had determined that Mayor Green, in collusion with his son, had conspired to destroy my marriage. I was considering charges like procurement and solicitation by proxy. The judge, though aware, was only guilty of not sharing the information I needed. Julie had nothing more to do with Jimmy and moved away shortly after our divorce was finalized. Her boss had found her a good job in another town with a law school friend of his. She followed my advice and got out before things got any worse. Bart fully cooperated with me and apologized to his sister for his role in the situation. He confirmed my suspicions that Mayor Green had threatened him. If he didn't support Jimmy's plan, he'd lose his position as sheriff and be replaced by a fool of the mayor's choosing. Despite his flaws, Bart has always been an excellent sheriff, and any replacement chosen by Mayor Green would be detrimental to the force. One evening, Bart and Janet joined Cynthia and me for dinner, and we enjoyed some fantastic fried chicken that Cynthia had cooked herself. Not only is Cynthia incredible in bed, but she's also a great cook. And Jimmy gave her up for Julie? Well, everyone has their own tastes. After dinner, while we were having some beers, we discussed the plan. I went over the basics and mentioned that the schedule was being adjusted slightly so Mayor Green could be served with the divorce papers first. This town was about to get a serious shakeup. The first step was to check in with Phil and see what his private investigator had uncovered. I called him, and the report was promising. He had collected a significant amount of dirt on our esteemed mayor and his troublesome son. Janet expressed some guilt about how she had raised Jimmy, but after we reassured her that he was just like his father, she came around. I couldn't blame her. She shared how her husband had transformed over the years from a kind, wonderful man into a corrupt tyrant. It reminded me of the old saying, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." It certainly applied to Mayor Green and his management of our town. In the end, it became clear that by using his son as a confidant, he demonstrated that no woman is immune from their intrigues. I felt sorry for Julie when I found out about this detail. The conversation on the tape made me sick when Phil played it to us in his office. Mayor Green: "Just divorce her, Jimmy. Give this woman what she wants and I'll make sure she leaves town." Jimmy: "But Dad, she can't just divorce me. She is mine, and I can dispose of her as I see fit." Mayor: "Jimmy, we need to cut our losses. People are starting to gossip, and we need to resolve this quickly. Don't worry about Cal. I'm going to get him fired and get him out of town. Cynthia should go with him. You've screwed up enough already." Jimmy: "How can you say that, Dad? You told me yourself that Julie is ready to do whatever I want for me. You persuaded Bart to spend more time with him and call him." Mayor: "Well, you let her slip away." Jimmy: "I was in jail, in case you forgot. How was I supposed to know that Cynthia would give me away for correcting her? This woman needs to be dealt with." Mayor: "Don't worry about Cynthia. I have plans for her. You just focus on yourself and lay low for a while." Jimmy: "Okay, Dad, just make sure she's not going to get a divorce. Make it look like an accident." Phil stopped recording. I looked at Cynthia, Janet, and then at Bart. "That's enough to prove a conspiracy," Bart said, and Phil nodded. Then Bart turned to me. "Do you want to deal with this, son?" I grinned and checked my Colt. "I would be honored, sir," I replied with a smile. Then he looked at Cynthia. "Honey, stay here with Phil. Bart and I have something to do." Cynthia hugged me and kissed me hard, putting all her love into that kiss. "Be careful, baby," she whispered, "and I love you." "I love you too, honey," I said, smiling back at her encouragingly. "Don't worry. Bart and I will take care of everything." We climbed into Bart's car outside Phil's office, and he activated the lights and siren as we sped over to the mayor's estate, where Jimmy was staying. During the drive, he called Judge Reinhold, still no relation, and obtained a warrant for their arrests based on the private investigator's wiretaps. Gotta love the Patriot Act. Upon arrival, Mayor Green was wrapping up dinner with his son, and they didn't hear us approach after Bart turned off the siren. We pulled up to the mansion, and with guns drawn, we went inside. Bart demonstrated he still had the skills by kicking in the door. "What the hell is going on here?" Mayor Green shouted. Jimmy looked utterly terrified when he saw my .357 and Bart's .44 single-action army aimed at them. I kept my gun on Jimmy while Bart moved forward and read out the charges. "Frederick Green, you and your son Jimmy Green are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent. If you choose to speak, anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You also have the right to an attorney, and to have that attorney present during questioning. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them?" Bart holstered his Colt, cuffed Fred behind his back, ensuring the cuffs were tight and the keyholes out of reach, then seated the mayor and covered Jimmy while I read him his rights and cuffed him as well. After securing both of them in the back seat of Bart's Charger, we headed back to the station to process them. In a rare display of sense, Jimmy kept quiet. With Fred in the holding cell and Jimmy in the interrogation room, I walked in with Cynthia. I slammed the paperwork down in front of Fred and then played the tape where he essentially confessed to plotting his wife's murder. Jimmy listened to everything and turned pale, his face drained of color as he comprehended the depth of his predicament. "That's not admissible in court," he protested. "That's irrelevant, Jimmy," I replied with a shrug. "What matters here is the court of public opinion. If we invoke the Patriot Act and present this conversation to Homeland Security, it could easily be twisted into something that looks like plotting an act of terror." I was laying it on thick, but I was having a lot of fun with it. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, clearly defeated. He knew he was in a tight spot and that he was facing severe consequences if he didn't cooperate. "Once your lawyer arrives, you'll need to sign this document, transferring everything to Cynthia. The lawyer will witness it, and then it will go to the judge. The judge will grant Cynthia everything. You'll be going to prison for spousal battery, and afterward, you'll have to deal with whatever remains of your life. Do you understand how this is going to play out?" I asked, and he simply nodded. It felt satisfying to see the golden boy brought down a notch. "Jimmy, if you hadn't tried to seduce my wife, none of this would have happened. You messed with the wrong man's wife. Man, I'm sorry," he cried, his first genuine display of emotion. It was astonishing to see Jimmy Green actually crying. Cynthia and I exchanged shocked looks, then shared a smile as we turned our attention back to the sobbing Jimmy Green. "Shut up, Jimmy," Cynthia snapped. "You and your bastard father were planning to kill me. You're just sorry you got caught." That realization jolted Jimmy out of his stupor, and he seemed to mentally shut down, staring blankly at the wall. When his lawyer arrived, I played the recording for him, and he closed his eyes with an exasperated sigh. When I detailed my plan to broadcast the recording to local news stations and major networks, it shook Jimmy out of his daze and led him to sign the divorce papers. We had the same success with Fred Green, who signed without hesitation once his lawyer arrived. Since we hadn't put it in writing that we would withhold evidence if they cooperated, we proceeded to send copies of the tape to news stations, the big three networks, and even Fox News, along with a copy to the state attorney general's office. It felt like a small thermonuclear explosion had rocked our quiet town. News vans were everywhere, and law enforcement agencies from state troopers to the FBI flooded our small community, boosting the local motel industry. For a small farming town, we were making a lot of money for the city, and it turned out to be quite the spectacle for everyone, except for Jimmy and Fred Green. The feds dug deep and uncovered questionable tax practices from Fred's past and some dubious activities in Jimmy's daily operations at City Hall. When everything settled, Bart was cleared of any wrongdoing, despite Jimmy and Fred's attempts to implicate him in the affair scandal. Julie was subpoenaed to testify about the whole mess and faced some negative media attention, but I set the record straight, portraying her as a victim too. She was young and naive. When asked in an interview if I would reconcile with her, I firmly said no. I stood my ground on that. Cynthia received everything in her divorce from Jimmy, and Janet received everything in her divorce from Fred. For their roles in the conspiracy and other charges the feds uncovered, they faced significant prison time, likely spending the rest of their lives behind bars once all the guilty verdicts and sentences were handed down. Cynthia and I got married with her parents returning to town for our wedding. Julie showed up, having been invited, and brought her new boyfriend. I talked with him, and he turned out to be a genuinely good guy. I was actually happy for her. As for Jimmy, he found love again, according to the grapevine. His cellmate, a very large but affectionate man, became his new partner. After 6 months in prison, Jimmy's farts stopped making noise. Jimmy's uncle, Judge Roy Green, was investigated alongside his brother and nephew. The feds discovered irregularities in his cases and verdicts, revealing that he had been accepting bribes and engaging in other illegal activities. It also turned out that Alice had been the one to expose him to the feds. I guess it's no surprise why. He ended up in federal prison after Alice took him to the cleaners in their divorce as well. As for Fred, the former mayor, he went on to star in numerous prison musicals, often performing soprano parts. Julie ended up marrying the boyfriend she brought to my and Sin's wedding, and they now live in the city. The last I heard, she's expecting a baby. Good for her. Bart has retired and is now enjoying his golden years with his wife. They're empty nesters now, and he still drops by the office from time to time. As for me, I became sheriff after the new mayor was elected. Mayor Barton, a divorced woman who stood up to her ex-husband when he abused his power, earned our town's respect. Janet took over her ex-husband's job and appointed me sheriff after Bart retired. Now, here I am, years after that fateful day when I was pulled away from date night with Julie. I'm holding my baby son while a very pregnant Cynthia is feeding our 2-year-old daughter. Life is good. We've converted the guest room into a nursery, and our toddler has her own room. We have 4 bedrooms, and Cynthia has made it clear that this will be our last child. She's planning to get her tubes tied after this one arrives. As she puts it, the baby factory's closing down, but the playground will still be open. I love my wife. Just wanted to say that up front. Grin.